The fluorescent lights hummed above Seattle General's ICU like a swarm of insects trapped in glass, and Brooke Sullivan moved through the unit at 6:27 a.m. with the kind of practiced efficiency that made her nearly invisible. Her scrubs were faded to the color of storm clouds, her badge clipped to a lanyard she kept loose so it wouldn't catch on anything. She didn't rush. Rushing looked panicked. Rushing looked like you didn't know what you were doing, and Brooke always knew exactly what she was doing. She passed the nurse's station without stopping, her eyes tracking the monitors in her peripheral vision, cardiac rhythms, oxygen saturation, intracranial pressures all displayed in neat rows like a language only some people could read fluently. Room 312 needed labs drawn. Room 316 was ready for extubation. Room 314 was the one that mattered, though nobody at Seattle General understood why yet. The Army Ranger in room 314 hadn't moved his legs in 6 weeks. His name was Marcus Webb, and his chart read like a rejection letter written 20 times over. 20 doctors. She had counted. 20 clinicians in white coats had walked into this room, looked at the spinal cord transection from a blast fragmentation in Kandahar, and walked back out with the same phrase, resource allocation. Low probability outcomes. Better suited for comfort care. The letters were stacked on his bedside table in a small, damning pile. Brooke rolled a dressing cart into the room and felt the air pressure change the moment Webb's eyes found her. That was always how she knew someone was truly conscious, not the Glasgow coma scale or the pupil reaction, but that singular moment when the eyes tracked with intention. His eyes were the color of worn denim, and they followed her hands as she pulled the latex gloves up past her wrists with a sharp snap that echoed off the tile. "Morning, Ranger," she said quietly. No extra words. No false cheerfulness. Just acknowledgement. Webb's mouth moved slightly, the closest he could manage to speech through the morphine fog that clung to him like humidity. His arms lay useless at his sides. Below the waist, nothing. But his eyes were alive, and they watched her approach his left leg where the surgical site from his latest failed reconstruction attempt was beginning to show signs of necrotic tissue. Brooke began the dressing change with movements that had the quality of ritual, precise, economical, nothing wasted. She soaked the gauze with normal saline and began to debridate the edges of the wound, removing the tissue that had already begun to die. Her fingers moved through the exact pattern that had been drilled into her muscle memory at Fort Sam Houston's Advanced Combat Medic course, the specific technique taught only to soldiers who operated in field conditions where infection meant amputation or death. Circular motions. Never tearing. Assessment as you worked, color changes, depth indicators, resistance of healthy tissue. Webb's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched. Something flickered across his morphine-hazed expression, the kind of recognition that didn't need words. He had seen that technique before. He had probably used it himself, back when he was 3rd Battalion squad medic, before the blast turned his spine into shrapnel. "Your squad medic teach you," he managed, his voice rasping like sandpaper on wood. Brooke didn't pause in her work. Similar sources. It wasn't a lie. Fort Sam Houston was a very particular source. Most civilian nurses learned their debridement technique from textbooks written by surgeons who had never treated blast wounds in a dirt compound under sporadic fire. Brooke had learned it from people who had done exactly that. She moved through the procedure with the kind of focused attention that made time disappear, the real world narrowing to just the wound, the tissue, the constant assessment of what needed to stay and what needed to come away. She was so focused on the work that she didn't hear Dr. Mercer arrive in the doorway until his shadow fell across the foot of the bed. He stood there for exactly 17 seconds before she became aware of him, she counted without meaning to, the habit of someone trained to notice details that might save lives. Dr. Mercer was a tall man with a kind of posture that suggested he had spent most of his life expecting people to move out of his way. His suit cost more than Brooke's car. His watch was Swiss. His fingernails were manicured in a way that suggested he hadn't actually touched a patient in probably 5 years, just gestured at them from a clinical distance while residents did the real work. His eyes tracked from Webb to Brooke's hands to her face, and when his gaze landed on her charting at the bedside, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had noticed that pattern over the past 3 weeks. Every time he saw her meticulous documentation of post-operative billing codes, of the specific medications administered and the exact times they were logged, his expression darkened like a storm front rolling inland. Brooke finished the dressing change and disposed of the contaminated gauze with the kind of methodical care that suggested this was the most important medical waste in human history. She didn't acknowledge Dr. Mercer's presence. The power of doing nothing was something most people never learned. Most people felt obligated to fill silence with words, with deference, with small gestures of recognition. Brooke had been trained in a different doctrine, the doctrine of the invisible operative, the person who did extraordinary things while remaining so forgettable that witnesses later couldn't provide a reliable description. She secured the final piece of tape and stepped back from the bed, pulling off her gloves with a soft snapping sound that echoed against the hospital room's sterile quiet. "He needs the dressing changed every 6 hours," she said to Dr. Mercer, her voice level as a horizon line. "The tissue response to saline versus the synthetic substitute is showing better granulation. The infection markers are trending down." Dr. Mercer nodded without saying anything. He was looking at Webb's chart now, at the notes she had written in her small, precise handwriting. She could see his pupils dilate slightly as he read, the kind of subtle physiological response that indicated someone had just encountered information they found deeply, profoundly unwelcome. His fingers closed around the clipboard with a pressure that would have left marks if the board could bruise. "I'll review your documentation," he said finally, his voice moving through the room like a blade sliding into water, smooth, cold, and leaving no trace of disturbance. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 20 minutes later in the break room, when Brooke sat down at the small table with her thermos of black coffee and a container of yogurt she had brought from home. Sarah, one of the day shift nurses, was gathering her lunch bag from the refrigerator. She glanced at Brooke, her expression flickering through something that looked almost like sympathy before she turned and walked toward the door. Then Jen followed. Then Rodriguez. Then the new nurse, Patterson, who had been friendly enough during the last shift. They didn't say anything. They just left, one after another, like dominoes falling in slow motion. The vending machine hummed in the corner, its mechanical breathing the only sound left in the room. It was a small thing. Nurses left the break room all the time, had places to be, had patients waiting. But it wasn't an accident. It was intentional in the way that quiet things often are, a small social extinction that required no words and no confrontation. Brooke opened her yogurt and began to eat, her hands perfectly steady, her breathing unchanged. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away from the small carton in her hands. This too was a kind of training, recognizing the moment when you were being isolated, when the machinery of institutional pressure had begun to grind, and understanding that the only response was to remain absolutely, completely present. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head. In room 314, an Army Ranger whose spine had been shattered by a blast in Kandahar lay in his bed with his eyes still tracking toward the doorway, still thinking about the way those hands had moved through the debridement, the way someone had touched him like his life still mattered. And in his office down the hall, Dr. Mercer was already composing his thoughts, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he mentally drafted the first line of the incident report that would justify making Brooke Sullivan disappear before she could connect the patterns in the billing codes, the phantom procedures, the surgeries that never happened but were still charged at $4,200 each, the elaborate infrastructure of fraud that had been funding his lifestyle for 18 months. Room 314 smelled like antiseptic and expensive cologne, Mercer's trademark scent arriving before his body filled the doorway. Brooke didn't look up from the 4 line, her fingers steady as she adjusted the infusion rate, but she felt the temperature shift the moment he entered. The ranger's wife, Patricia, sat in the visitor's chair with her shoulders tense. Their teenage son, Marcus Jr., stood near the window, pretending to study the parking lot below. "That dosing doesn't align with his renal panel from 0600, Brooke said quietly, still focused on the 4-port. Her voice carried the precision of someone reading technical data, not challenging authority. "Creatinine is 1.8. The protocol assumes normal kidney function. We should adjust to 75 milligrams instead of the full dose." Mercer's footsteps stopped. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Nurse Sullivan." His voice dropped into that clinical register he reserved for dismantling people in public. Perhaps you missed the seminar on scope of practice. Or do they not cover the hierarchy of medical decision-making in whatever program you attended? He stepped closer, positioning himself between Brooke and the patient's bed like he was reclaiming territory. Patricia's hand found the armrest. Marcus Jr. turned from the window, watching. This medication protocol was designed by physicians with actual medical degrees, Mercer continued, each word a hammer strike. Not glorified cafeteria workers with delusions of competence. Brooke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A muscle moved once beneath her skin, barely visible. But her hands never hesitated. She continued her work, checking the oxygen saturation monitor, verifying the ventilator settings, documenting vitals in the electronic chart with the same methodical precision she'd applied to combat casualty care in Kandahar. Her face remained neutral as polished stone. "Doctor, the dosing contradicts his renal function labs from this morning," she said, her voice low and measured. Not deferential. Not defensive. Simply factual. Perhaps you'd like to review them together. What I'd like, Mercer said, turning to face her fully, is for Nurse Nobody here to remember her place. The nickname hung in the air like a blade. Patricia's eyes widened. Marcus Jr. took a step forward, then stopped. Brooke didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge the insult existed. Mercer pivoted smoothly toward the family, his face transforming into something warm and apologetic. "I apologize for the interruption. We're working on improving our staff training protocols. Sometimes nurses develop inflated opinions of their diagnostic capabilities." He smiled, the kind of smile that made you believe he was suffering through incompetence with grace. "Rest assured, I personally designed this protocol based on 23 years of clinical experience. Your husband is in excellent hands." Patricia nodded slowly, her confidence in Brooke visibly eroding. That was the calculus Mercer understood perfectly: undermine the nurse in front of the family, and the family becomes a weapon against her. They stop trusting her judgment. They start watching for mistakes. They mention her attitude problems in their discharge surveys. Brooke continued her rounds as if Mercer had said nothing. She adjusted the bed angle, checked the catheter placement, verified the feeding tube position. Her movements carried the muscle memory of someone who'd performed these tasks under fire, when interruptions could be fatal. Her hands had held lives together in conditions that would have broken most people. A physician's insult barely registered as noise. But it registered. Everything registered. That afternoon, Brooke sat in the break room with her lunch tray, a turkey sandwich and a container of yogurt she'd brought from home. She'd learned not to expect the hospital cafeteria to have anything that didn't come from a freezer bag. For nurses gathered their lunches from the refrigerator the moment she settled at the table. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't exchange pleasantries. They simply collected their food and left, their chairs scraping back in perfect synchronization. The message was surgical in its precision: "You're alone here." The vending machine hummed its mechanical rhythm in the empty room. Brooke ate her sandwich without tasting it, because that was another skill from the field: you consumed fuel when fuel was available, flavor irrelevant. She'd watched men die from preventable complications because they were too proud to admit they needed help, too isolated to ask. She knew how isolation worked as a tool. Mercer was wielding it like a scalpel. When she finished, she deposited her tray in the sink and walked to the unit bulletin board. A typed disciplinary write-up had been posted in the staff notification section where everyone would see it. 3 colleagues read it as she stood there. All 3 looked away when she passed. By 1400 hours, Mercer had made 4 phone calls from his office with the door closed. The scheduling coordinator received the first call: Nurse Sullivan was being reassigned to night shift pediatrics effective immediately, per Dr. Mercer's recommendation. The second call went to Patricia Rothschild, the board member who oversaw staff performance and who owed Mercer a favor from when he'd hired her nephew as a surgical resident despite mediocre board scores. The third call reached Gerald Hayes, the other appointed board member, who received the same message: Sullivan's personnel file was being flagged for pattern of overreach, unauthorized chart access, and questioning a physician judgment. The fourth call went to the hospital administrator's office to formalize the shift change. Mercer sat in his leather chair with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the same posture he'd held the previous day. His empire of fraud had been running smoothly for 18 months. Phantom procedures coded at $4,200 each, running through post-surgical recovery where documentation was complex enough that nobody questioned the billing. 18 months of supplemental income that had purchased the lake house, the Tesla, the membership at the country club where judges and hospital board members played golf on Thursday afternoons. But Brooke Sullivan had started looking at the charts with the focused precision of someone trained to see patterns in chaos. She'd asked questions about resource allocation. She'd cross-referenced billing against actual services rendered. She'd accessed files that should have been beneath her operational clearance. Yesterday she'd been at the nurse's station at 0230, photographing something on the computer screen with her phone before deleting the browser history. He'd watched her do it from the hallway, understanding immediately that she'd found something. She was the kind of person who couldn't leave things alone. The kind who noticed discrepancies and followed threads until they unraveled entire systems. She had to go, and she had to go before she connected enough dots to make anyone listen. His hands moved across the keyboard, drafting the formal reassignment documentation. Night shift pediatrics was where institutional ghosts went to fade away, exhausted, demoralized, working while their own children slept, their clinical skills atrophying from lack of complexity. In 6 months, her confidence would be gone. In a year, she'd quit. That evening, Brooke stood in the parking lot of Seattle General as rain began to hammer the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. Her scrubs clung to her skin, still damp from the clinical day. She'd received the shift reassignment notification in her mailbox at the end of her shift, handwritten, professional, final. Night shift pediatrics. Effective immediately. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, *Mom home yet? Emma has soccer practice at 5*. She looked at the timestamp. 1,647 hours. She'd have to pick Emma up in 20 minutes, drive across town in rush-hour traffic that would take 40. She'd sit in the bleachers and watch her 8-year-old small body move through practiced drills while mothers with normal jobs exchanged schedules and carpools and the kind of casual friendship that came from predictable hours. She'd been reassigned to night shift, which meant she'd sleep when Emma woke. She'd work while Emma slept. She'd be home for mornings, gone for evenings, working while the city darkened and the pediatric ward filled with fevered children and panicked families and the weight of other people's emergencies. She'd been running from Kandahar for 7 years, staying invisible, keeping her head down, assuming that if she worked hard enough and asked nothing of the system would leave her alone. Instead, Dr. Mercer had just made her disappear. Her hand was steady as she texted back, *running late. I'll get her. Love you. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had been right about one thing: she had been looking at things beyond her operational clearance. She had been noticing patterns. And she had found something that made her understand, with the clarity of someone trained to recognize threats, exactly how deep the corruption ran and exactly how many people would suffer because of it. 20 doctors had refused to treat the Ranger. 20 separate rejections, all citing resource allocation and low probability outcomes. She'd seen those rejection letters stacked on his bedside table during her first shift, each one a small cruelty wrapped in institutional language. But she'd also found the billing codes that explained why they refused. The phantom procedures that made the Ranger's case unprofitable. The infrastructure of fraud that had been built to make people like him, broken soldiers with complicated injuries and uncertain outcomes, economically undesirable. Dr. Mercer wasn't just punishing her for noticing. He was protecting an entire system designed to make the damaged invisible. And that was a problem Brooke Sullivan was uniquely equipped to solve. The Ranger's vitals had been stable for 8 hours. That stability meant nothing. Brooke knew the signs, the ones that screamed silently on monitors while doctors scrolled through charts, seeing numbers instead of a man dying in front of them. She was turning him, standard protocol every 2 hours to prevent pressure ulcers from eating through his skin, when she felt it. The resistance in his chest. The asymmetrical rise and fall of his rib cage. His left side barely moving. She stopped mid-turn, her hand still supporting his shoulder, and looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 94. 89. 82. The curve was too steep. Not gradual drift. Free fall. She didn't announce it. Didn't call for help in the panicked way civilians do when something breaks. She simply released his shoulder and stepped to the monitor, reading the rhythm. The ranger's eyes tracked her movement. Even through the morphine, even through the paralysis that had stolen his mobility, something in his expression shifted. Recognition. A combat medic's recognition of someone who moved like they'd done this before. Under fire. In dust. When there was no attending physician, no crash cart, no hospital 3 blocks away. Just blood and counting and the question of whether someone's family would get the body or the man. She could feel his attention now, heavy and questioning, but there was no time for answers because his oxygen saturation had hit 71 and his jugular vein was distending like a balloon filling with the wrong kind of pressure. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart. Every breath was filling his chest cavity with air that had nowhere to go. The pressure was building like a vice around his failing heart. She moved toward the call button, but before her hand reached it, the attending physician appeared in the doorway. Dr. Garrison, surgical resident, competent on good days and utterly useless when panic arrived. His face had already gone pale. His hands were already trembling. He looked at the monitor, then at the ranger, then back at the monitor, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. 70. 68. The numbers were dropping in real time. The attending's mouth kept opening. No words came out. "We need to get him to OR," he finally managed. "We need to page surgery. We need." "He won't make it to the elevator," Brooke said. Her voice was flat. Statement of fact, not emotion. Not a request. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed left lung. Heart's being compressed. "We've got 3 minutes. Maybe 4 if we're lucky." The attending stared at her. Stared at her the way people stare when someone has just said something in a language they don't recognize. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. His rhythm was starting to degrade. 65 now. Dropping. The attending's hands came up to his face, pressing against his temples like he could think this away, like the right algorithm would suddenly materialize and tell him what to do. He'd been trained for this. CCP board certification, 3 years of residency, 1,000 lectures on airway management and shock protocols. His training was all there, perfectly archived in his mind, completely inaccessible because his nervous system had decided that panic was more important than memory. Brooke moved. She didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for an order that would take too long anyway. She yanked the crash cart aside, the wheels squealed in protest, and positioned herself at the bedside. Her right hand went to her scrub pocket and came back with a folding knife. Not a scalpel. Not a surgical instrument. A combat knife with a serrated edge and a blade that had seen 1,000 field applications in a war that still wore her name, even though her name had been legally burned away 18 months ago. The attending made a sound. A protest or a gasp, she didn't categorize it. Didn't care. She was already palping the ribs, feeling the landmarks, finding the space between the 4th and 5th intercostal. The knife opened in her palm like it had muscle memory all its own. "You can't, that's not sterile," the attending stammered. "Sterile doesn't matter when he's dead," Brooke said. The knife made contact. One smooth motion, anatomically perfect. Through the skin. Through the fascia. Between the ribs. She felt the membrane give. The hiss of pressurized air escaping like someone had opened a valve on a tire. The ranger's chest deflated slightly. The pressure released. She packed the wound with gauze from the crash cart, her movements economical and precise, every motion the way they drilled it at Fort Sam Houston when she was still Captain Sullivan with a name and a rank and a future that didn't include civilian hospitals. Her left hand found his sternum. She positioned her fingers, interlaced them, and began compression. 1, 2, 3, 4. Manual cardiac massage. Her hands moved with a rhythm that had nothing to do with conscious thought and everything to do with muscle memory that lived in her cells. The monitor showed asystole. Flat line. No electrical activity. No perfusion. The attending had backed against the wall, watching her work like she was performing surgery with her bare hands. The ranger's wife stood in the corner, her hand over her mouth, eyes locked on the knife and the blood and the woman in scrubs who was pushing her husband's heart in a way that defied every protocol she'd ever seen. Brooke's jaw was tight. Her face was composed in a way that looked like calm but was actually the precise opposite. It was control so absolute it bordered on frightening. Her compression rhythm stayed steady. The trauma shears from the crash cart had been used to cut his hospital gown away. The wound between his ribs was exposed, packing visible, her hand pressing against his chest in a way that looked violent until you understood it was salvation. Counter compressions. 50. 60. 70. The monitor twitched. A single electrical spike, barely visible, then flat line again. She kept compressions. 80. 90. 110. The attending was saying something about epinephrine, about defibrillation pads, about AHA guidelines, but she'd moved past guidelines. She was operating in a space where protocols were luxuries you couldn't afford. Where decisions happened in a 3-second window between life and the alternative, and every second of hesitation was a second closer to the wrong answer. The monitor flickered. Irregular. Chaotic. Ventricular fibrillation. Electricity without coherence. She kept pressing. Her compression continued, relentless and perfect. 140. 160. The monitor stabilized. The chaos organized into something resembling a rhythm. A weak rhythm. A barely there rhythm. But a rhythm. The ranger's eyes moved. Not conscious movement. Not awareness. But movement. The electrical activity of a heart starting to remember how to beat. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Regular now. Slower. 72 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm restored. The room didn't just go quiet. The quiet was so complete it seemed to erase sound as a concept. The ranger's wife's hand dropped from her mouth. The attending stared at Brooke's hands, at the knife, at the chest wound, at the monitor that was displaying numbers that meant something in the language of life instead of death. Brooke's compression continued, steady and slower now, just maintaining pressure while the heart did its own work. She looked at the attending without expression. Call surgery. We need a proper chest tube and a surgical team. He's stable but not out of the woods. Her voice had changed somewhere during the crisis. It wasn't the deferential nurse voice anymore. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The attending nodded and moved toward the phone like someone operating in a dream. The ranger's eyes found hers across the chaos. His pupils were still blown from the morphine, his body still locked in paralysis, but something in his gaze had shifted. Sharpened. A former combat medic from 3rd Battalion recognizing the exact protocol from Fort Sam Houston, the way she'd angled the knife, the pressure point she'd used, the manual compression technique that nobody taught in civilian hospitals because civilian hospitals didn't need techniques invented in a war zone. His lips parted but no words came. Not because he was paralyzed. Because he already knew. She could see it in the sudden clarity behind his eyes. He knew she wasn't just a nurse. He knew exactly what she'd been, and that knowledge shifted something fundamental in how he was looking at her. And that's when Dr. Mercer's face appeared in the doorway. Dr. Mercer's shoes made no sound on the ICU tile. That was the first thing Brooke noticed, not the man himself, but the absence of footstep noise, as if he'd learned to move through hospitals the way predators move through tall grass. He appeared in the doorway 30 seconds after the ranger's heart resumed its rhythm, his face carrying the careful blankness of someone whose internal calculations were too important to display. His eyes moved across the monitor, sinus rhythm, O2 sat climbing steadily toward 94, then to the chest tube Brooke had just secured with silk sutures, then to Brooke herself, still wearing the ranger's blood like a second set of scrubs. The attending physician had finally moved. He stood near the window, trembling slightly, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets where they couldn't betray how completely he had frozen. "Nurse Sullivan." Mercer's voice was flat as a line on a dead monitor. "Step away from the patient." Brooke continued checking the tube placement, her hand steady as the surgical laser they'd taught her at Fort Sam Houston, verifying that each placement was secure, that the sutures would hold, that this man would breathe tomorrow. She didn't turn around. "You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure without physician supervision." Mercer moved closer, his presence like pressure changing in a room before a storm hits. "That's grounds for immediate termination and possible criminal charges. Step away now." The ranger's eyes followed Brooke as she finally stepped back. His pupils were reactive. His color was improving. The manual compression had restored perfusion. She'd held his heart in her hands for 47 seconds until it remembered how to beat on its own. His mouth moved around the endotracheal tube, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Mercer reached for the phone in his pocket before they'd even left the room. The first call came from the hallway outside the ICU. Brooke heard his voice through the door's small reinforced window, clinical, professional, absolutely lethal. "I need an immediate reassignment for one of my nursing staff. Effective this shift. Night shift pediatrics. I'll send the paperwork." She didn't need to hear the responses. She knew what they sounded like. She'd heard them from 20 different doctors over the past 5 days, the same careful language, the same clinical tone, the same decision already made before the conversation even began. 20 doctors refusing this one ranger. 20 rejections, each one stacked on his bedside table like a deck of cards slowly building into something heavier than any single person should have to carry. The second call came 4 minutes later. Mercer's voice was different now, harder, the way a blade sounds when it's being sharpened against stone. "Flag her personnel file for unauthorized invasive procedures constituting practice outside scope of licensure." Pause. "Full documentation of the incident in ICU." "Yes, today." "Immediate effect." Security arrived at shift change. 2 officers, both with the careful neutral expression of men who'd been trained to feel nothing about the people they removed from buildings. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. One simply nodded toward the exit, and Brooke followed, still wearing the scrub soaked with the ranger's blood because she hadn't been given time to change. Her badge didn't scan at the main exit. The magnetic strip had been deactivated, a small click, a red light instead of green, and the door stayed locked until one of the security officers swiped his own card. Dr. Mercer watched from his office window on the 3rd floor. She could see him there, dark silhouette against fluorescent light, watching her walk across the parking lot toward her car. She could see the small movement that might have been a smile. The 3rd and 4th phone calls came at 6:17 p.m. and 6:33 p.m. She found out about those later, details that would surface in the disciplinary hearing notice. Mercer scheduling the hearing with 2 board members he'd personally appointed 3 years ago, men who owed him favors or money or both. Mercer drafting the termination justification in real time, his language precise and devastating: gross negligence, unauthorized practice, significant liability exposure, immediate action required. Each phrase was a nail, carefully placed, designed to make her unhireable anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. That night at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, Brooke sat with tears running silently down her face, the first emotion she'd shown in the 16 hours since she'd walked into the ICU that morning. Not trembling. Not shaking. Just water moving down her skin like rain on a window, quiet and deliberate and completely unstoppable. Her daughter found her there at 11:43 p.m. 8 years old, still in pajamas, padding barefoot into the kitchen because the nightmares had come again. Brooke's daughter climbed into her lap without asking questions, the way children do when they sense something has broken in the adult they love. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Brooke couldn't answer. She was supposed to be on night shift. She was supposed to be checking on small lungs, making sure pediatric feline stayed patent, holding the hands of children too young to understand why their bodies had betrayed them. Instead, she was here, in a kitchen that smelled like microwaved coffee and desperation, unable to explain why the people she'd saved had sent her away. The classified operation at Kandahar had a cover story now. The official record said she was never there. The promotion that came with the Silver Star existed only in sealed files she couldn't access. Sergeant Maria Diaz, the teammate who died covering her position during the extraction that never officially happened, had been erased from her service record. Brooke Sullivan, captain in the United States Army Medical Corps, had been ordered to disappear 7 years ago. She'd been told never to surface, never to acknowledge the people she'd trained with, never to speak the name of the operation that had cost Maria everything. She was supposed to be a ghost, invisible, untraceable, safe in her obscurity. She had followed that order perfectly. She'd changed her name on her civilian credentials, moved to Savannah, worked night shifts and weekends, asked for nothing, spoke to no one, became the kind of nurse that people forgot was in the room until they suddenly realized their bleeding had stopped, their pain was manageable, their will to survive had come back in the time it took her to change a dressing. And now even that small refuge was crumbling because she dared to save one more soldier. One more man who recognized the way her hands moved, the precision of her technique, the terrible certainty that comes from having held a human heart in your hands and felt it stutter back to life. "Mommy." Her daughter's voice was small, uncertain. "I'm okay, baby." The words were true and completely insufficient. Just a hard day. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing what would come next. The worst part was understanding that Dr. Mercer was intelligent enough, strategic enough, and ruthless enough to understand what he'd done. He'd exposed her. Even if he didn't know the details, he'd pulled at a thread that was connected to classified protocols and Pentagon oversight and people in Washington who'd spent 7 years making sure she stayed buried. He'd filed a complaint. He'd documented an incident. He'd triggered exactly the kind of official inquiry that would force the very exposure she'd been ordered to prevent. Her daughter fell asleep against her chest, warm and trusting, and Brooke sat in the darkness of the kitchen, still wearing clothes soaked with another man's blood, waiting for the phone call that would change everything. She didn't have to wait long. In exactly 36 hours, the Pentagon would call. In exactly 36 hours, her daughter would finally understand why her mother kept that folded flag locked in a drawer at the back of her closet. In exactly 36 hours, Captain Brooke Sullivan would stop being invisible. But tonight, she was just a nurse who'd broken protocol. A woman who'd stepped outside her scope of practice. A person who'd had everything taken away because she couldn't stop saving people, even when saving them would cost her the only life she'd managed to build in exile. The silence of the kitchen pressed down like weight. Outside, rain began to fall on Savannah, hammering the porch like applause for a performance no one was supposed to remember. The rain hammered against the apartment windows like a metronome counting down what was left of her career. Brooke hadn't slept. She'd watched the clock move from midnight to 3 a.m. to the pale grey of a Savannah dawn, still in her scrubs, the fabric stiff with dried blood that wasn't hers. Her daughter had asked 3 times why she was home. She'd given no answer because there was none that made sense. The classified life was collapsing into the civilian one, and there wasn't a protocol for that kind of extraction. The call came at 7:27 a.m. Not from Seattle General. From a number with a 703 area code. Virginia. The voice on the other end was female, measured, official. "Captain Sullivan, this is Personnel Security Operations, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. We're executing an emergency witness protection protocol review based on a flagged security clearance on your SSN. Can you confirm your location?" Brooke's hand tightened on the phone. DCSA didn't call unless something had broken in the classified vault. "I'm at my residence," she said. "Savannah, Georgia." Stay there. We're dispatching representatives. ETA 18 minutes. The line went dead. She stood in her kitchen, coffee untouched, watching the rain. 18 minutes. The Pentagon doesn't move like that unless someone had triggered something automated, something that bypassed normal channels and hit the security protocols directly. What happened next came in sequences. A black SUV pulled into her apartment complex at 8:03 a.m. Two Marines in dress uniforms exited. They didn't approach her door. They waited, radio earpieces glinting, until a second vehicle arrived, administrative sedan, government plates. Then they moved together toward her building. The knock was formal, precise. Not aggressive. Professional. She opened the door to a Marine colonel, a civilian liaison in a charcoal suit, and a second woman in DCSA credentials on a lanyard. The colonel's eyes registered something when he saw her. Recognition, maybe. Or the weight of knowing what she actually was. Captain Sullivan, the civilian said. Not a question. I'm with the Pentagon's Witness Protection Administrative Division. We need to transport you to Seattle General immediately. There's been a security incident involving your classified status. She didn't ask questions. Questions belong to people with choices. She grabbed her jacket. The folded flag was still in her locker at the hospital. That was the only thing that mattered now. The drive took 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. The rain intensified on the highway, and Brooke stared out the window at the blurred landscape. 36 hours ago she'd been fired by a hospital. Now the military was retrieving her like a classified asset that had been dropped behind enemy lines. The geometry of this made no sense until it did, until she understood that somewhere, someone had run a routine background audit and discovered that a nurse named Brooke Sullivan had a dormant security clearance that should have been impossible to trace. The system had flagged it. The dominoes had started falling. When they arrived at Seattle General, the hospital looked different. Armed security at the main entrance. Hospital administration in the hallway, faces tense. They escorted the delegation straight to the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. Dr. Mercer was already there, standing by the window, his expression confused and then calculating as the Marines entered. "What is this?" he asked. The tone was indignant. A man used to being the highest authority in every room. The 2-star general who entered next didn't answer. She was compact, silver hair, the kind of quiet presence that made the air pressure change. She carried a leather folder and moved like someone who'd given orders in places that weren't on maps. "I'm General Sarah Hutchins, Joint Special Operations Command. This office is now under military investigation protocol. Everyone except Captain Sullivan and the hospital administrator will exit. Now." Mercer didn't move. The general looked at him without expression. He left. The door closed behind him like a vault ceiling. What happened next existed in layers. In the ICU, the Ranger, Marcus Webb, Specialist 5th Class, 75th Ranger Regiment, lay in his recovery bed, his morphine-hazed eyes tracking the commotion in the hallway. When the Marines wheeled him into the conference room on a mobile bed, he stared at Brooke with sudden clarity. His voice, still rough from intubation, formed a single word. Ghost line. That was her call sign. That was her name in the only place it had ever been real. The general opened the folder. Inside were documents, citations, photographs of operations that officially never happened. She read aloud, and with each sentence the identity that Brooke Sullivan the nurse had carefully constructed began to dissolve. Captain Brooke Sullivan, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Joint Special Operations Command Task Force 121. Field amputation under fire, Kandahar Province, June 2017. Decision to amputate the right leg of Ranger First Class David Carver in a forward operating base with minimal surgical equipment, without anesthesia, under active enemy fire. That amputation saved Ranger Carver's life and permitted the successful extraction of 3 additional Rangers with severe trauma. The general paused. Silver Star Commendation, Captain Sullivan. That's the second highest Valor Award. for an operation that, officially, never occurred. Mercer had slipped back into the doorway. His face was going pale. Additionally, the general continued, Presidential Unit Citation for your service with 75th Ranger Regiment in Kandahar Province, 2016 to 2017. That citation has been classified until this moment. You've been operating under JSOC Witness Protection Protocol since 2017 because your testimony regarding operational decisions became material to a congressional inquiry into Special Operations Command Authority. The general closed the folder and stood. She walked to Brooke, who was still in civilian clothes, still looking like a nurse. The general pulled from her jacket a small American flag, folded into the compact triangle. That means death, that means honor, that means someone gave everything. Brooke's hands trembled before she could stop them. That flag was from her locker. From Sergeant Miguel Diaz. From the man who died covering her extraction. The ranger informed us where you kept this, the general said quietly. She saluted it first, then placed it in Brooke's hands. I'm sorry it took this long to acknowledge what you did. What you gave. The liaison stepped forward with a tablet. Your security protocols are being reclassified effective immediately. Your witness protection status is being converted to commendation status. The hospital administration is being briefed on your true identity and the circumstances of your termination. That termination is being reversed with compensation and reinstatement at whatever rank you choose. But Brooke wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at Mercer, who stood frozen in the doorway. His face had moved past pale. His eyes had that quality of a man watching his entire existence collapse in real time. He tried to speak. The general looked at him with the same expression she'd used to dismiss him minutes before. Complete erasure. 30 minutes later, after the military delegation had left and Seattle General's administrator had mumbled apologies and reinstated Brooke effective immediately, the video started spreading. A nurse who'd been in the hallway during Mercer's patient room humiliation had filmed it on her phone. His voice, recorded with clinical precision, dismissing Brooke as a glorified cafeteria worker, his condescension in front of the ranger's family, his certainty that she was beneath his consideration. The nurse who uploaded it didn't post it to social media. She posted it to MedEthics Monitor, a private forum where medical professionals discussed ethical violations. Within 4 hours, it had been shared 247 times. Within 8 hours, it reached Dr. Raymond Chen at Johns Hopkins, the department chair who'd written Mercer's recommendation letters 20 years ago, who'd endorsed his clinical judgment, who'd said he was a rising star in emergency medicine. Dr. Chen watched it 3 times. The second time, he stopped the video and called his assistant. "Get me the Johns Hopkins Communications Office," he said. "I'm issuing a formal professional statement." The statement was brief and devastating. "I was wrong about Dr. James Mercer. I withdraw any professional endorsement. What I observed in this video does not represent the values we hold as a profession. I take full responsibility for having failed to see what was apparently evident to his colleagues." That statement, from someone of Dr. Chen's stature, didn't trigger an investigation. It triggered something much worse for Mercer: institutional abandonment. The board members he'd appointed suddenly found reasons not to defend him. The hospital's legal team, smelling liability, immediately distanced the institution from his actions. Within 12 hours, auditors who'd previously overlooked his billing practices began looking at them with new eyes. The phantom billing codes Brooke had documented, the one she'd carefully listed in her incident reports, the one she'd submitted through proper channels before Mercer had her fired, suddenly became the center of a forensic accounting review. Phantom surgeries. Patients billed for procedures they'd never received. 72 hours of investigation unraveled 18 months of fraud. $2 million in unauthorized charges. Kickbacks from a medical supply company. Mercer's entire practice was a mechanism designed to maximize insurance reimbursement through procedures that never existed. The state medical board didn't wait. Emergency review. License suspension by Friday. License revocation by the following Tuesday. His malpractice insurance carrier dropped him. His practice manager called to say the office was closing immediately. Former colleagues who'd socialized with him at conferences suddenly couldn't be reached. The medical community that had elevated him now erased him with the efficiency of a surgical excision. He received termination papers by courier on Wednesday. His attorney advised against fighting it. The board had documentation, testimony, and now public accountability. Fighting would cost him money he no longer had and extend his public humiliation indefinitely. By the following month, Mercer was teaching CPR to high school students at Savannah Community College for $14 an hour. The pay was minimum wage plus a small stipend for materials. The position required no medical license, no peer review, no institutional authority. Just someone who knew chest compressions and could demonstrate them for teenagers who didn't know his name used to mean something. 6 months after that, after the FBI had finished their fraud investigation, after the hospital had settled quietly with affected patients, after Brooke had reclaimed her position in the ICU and begun training younger nurses in the techniques that no civilian nursing school could teach, the rehabilitation ceremony took place in Seattle General's main atrium. The Ranger walked across that stage on legs that the Pentagon's neurotechnology program had given him function in. Not full recovery. Not yet. But steps. Real, supported steps, his wife beside him, his kids in the front row. Experimental nerve stimulation technology, approved after military intervention, had rewired pathways that doctors said would never activate again. Brooke stood in her army dress uniform for the first time in 7 years. The jacket carried no insignia, witness protection didn't permit public rank identification, but the fabric was correct, the color was correct, the weight of it was real. Her daughter stood beside her, finally understanding why her mother had kept that folded flag on the mantle, why certain memories belonged to places she wouldn't describe, why sometimes she woke with her hand on a phantom knife. The hospital administrator thanked Brooke publicly. The Rangers' medical team acknowledged her rapid decision-making. The general who'd come to retrieve her sent a videotaped commendation that was played during the ceremony. The audience, nurses, doctors, patients, military personnel, applauded. In the back row, unnoticed, Mercer sat in civilian clothes. His face showed nothing. He'd learned that much. He watched the woman he'd tried to destroy receive recognition from the institution he'd once dominated. He watched the patient he'd written off as low-probability outcome walk across that stage. He watched the moment when he became entirely irrelevant to every story that mattered. After the ceremony ended, as people filed out and congratulations continued, Brooke kneeled to her daughter's level. The folded flag was in her other hand now, no longer hidden. "You asked me once why I stayed a nurse instead of going back to the army," she said quietly. "Why I chose to heal civilians instead of soldiers." Her daughter shook her head. She'd asked, but not in words. She'd asked in the quiet way children do, by watching their parents and wondering. "Because true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching," Brooke said. "It's the second thoracotomy when no cameras are running. It's the pressure-wound you dress at 3 in the morning when nobody's counting. It's the paralyzed ranger you refuse to abandon when 20 other doctors walked away." She stood, taking her daughter's hand, and looked at the ranger, at the way he held his wife, at the way his legs carried weight they hadn't carried in years, at the children who were now learning that their father was coming home. The general approached her one final time before leaving. "We could use you back on active duty, Captain. Full rank, full authority. JSOC's expanding their medical integration program." Brooke looked at her daughter. She looked at the folded flag. She looked at the uniform she was wearing, at the ICU visible through the atrium windows, at the patient she'd committed to healing. "I'm exactly where I need to be, sir," she said. "If you're hearing this, you know what happens when someone with everything to lose decides they have nothing left to lose, and decides to act anyway. That's when things change." Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet heroes who reshape their worlds without anyone watching. Like this video if you'd have made Brooke's choice. Comment, would you have risked everything for a stranger? And thanks for staying until the end. The best stories are the ones nobody expects to find true.